Well, I want to talk with you this morning about parenting. And I want you to know that I am keenly aware that I cannot speak from any personal experience. I suppose technically I am a stepfather. I was 46 when Kathy and I married, and her son John was already grown and gone, and so I had absolutely nothing to do with his rearing. And so I cannot stand before you as someone who has raised a whole passel of kids to love and serve God faithfully. And yet, when I say to you that I want to talk with you about parenting, that in and of itself, I think, should arouse the interest of every parent in this assembly and every grandparent. And young people who want to get married and raise kids one of these days, you should be interested in what we'll be talking about this morning. If I can get my computer working. But it's one particular aspect of parenting that we'll be focusing our attention upon this today. I want to talk with you about Proverbs and parental punishment. In other words, I want to talk with you about some Proverbs in the book of Proverbs that talk about the kind of punishment that parents should administer to their children so that they can bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. I suppose you could describe the book of Proverbs as God's how-to manual. And it deals with all kinds of subjects. It deals with almost every imaginable human relationship, including the parent-child relationship. It talks about how parents should instruct and teach their children, but it also talks about how parents should correct their children when they do wrong. And it's obvious from the book of Proverbs that this correction will at times involve punishment. So I want to begin by reading 6 Proverbs. And we'll be looking at them more closely as we continue in our study. In Proverbs chapter 13 and in verse 24, the wise man says, "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly." In Proverbs chapter 19 and in verse 18, the wise man says, "Chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction." In Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 15, the wise man says, "Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him." And in Proverbs 23 and verse 13, the wise man says, "Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die." Proverbs 29 verse 15 says, "The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother." Proverbs 29 verse 17, "Correct your child and He will give you rest. Yes, He will delight. He will give delight to your soul. Now, before we come back to some of those Proverbs and talk about them in more detail, I want to make some preliminary observations. And the first one being that word beat is not talking about child abuse. We're not talking about parents physically abusing their children. I did a little research on the original Hebrew term that's used by the wise man, and I found out that this term actually has a very wide semantic range. That means it can mean many different things in different contexts. And it is translated in a wide variety of ways in the New King James Version. For example, it is translated struck 117 times out of its 499 times of occurrence. It's even translated kill, strike, attack, defeat, conquer, slay, destroy, and many other ways. And so it can really refer to some very severe treatment. But it should be obvious to us that that's not what the wise man means in these Proverbs. We learn from Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 12, "For whom the Lord loves, He corrects, just as a father the son in whom He delights." Notice that the wise man is comparing the discipline of the Lord on His spiritual children with the kind of discipline that a father administers to his physical children. But notice, it is a discipline that comes from a father who delights in his children. Paul told the Ephesians in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." And even though it might sound like it upon a casual reading of some of these Proverbs, the wise man, when he talks about beating a child, is not talking about physical abuse. We need to understand that. And when he talks about a rod, he's not talking about a club. Again, the original Hebrew word can mean many different things in different contexts. In fact, it is translated by the English word tribe or tribes 137 times out of its 190 occurrences. Now, when I look at that, it just kind of blows my mind. How in the world can the same word mean tribe and then mean rod? Well, think about the English word bank. How many different meanings are there to the English word bank? Well, a bank can be where I deposit my paycheck, and a bank can be where Isaac stores his pennies, a piggy bank. And a bank can be what you stand on to fish. And a bank can be something that you do with an airplane. And so the English word bank means many different things in different contexts, and those various meanings don't necessarily have anything to do with these other definitions. But the writer's not talking about beating your children with a club. We also need to understand that spanking is not the only form of parental punishment that can and should be administered in the home. I don't remember exactly when it happened. I think I was probably in the 6th grade. I was taking a shower, and we had a metal shower stall in the bathroom that didn't go all the way up to the ceiling, and my brother Alan snuck in and he dumped cold water on me. Well, as you can imagine, I wasn't a happy camper, and I said, when I get out of here, I'm going to slug you. And Alan hollered in to my dad and said, Kevin's going to hit me. And my dad hollered back, Kevin, if you hit him, I'm going to spank you. And I thought about it. And I thought about it some more. And I decided I'm going to take my licks. I'm going to stand up for myself. And so when I was able, I slugged my brother Alan. Now, I just hit him in the arm. It wasn't in the stomach. It wasn't in the face. I hit him in the arm. And we came out, and my dad looked at me, and he said, Kevin, I'm not going to spank you. Well, that surprised me. Instead, my dad said, I'm going to take your basketball away from you for the next 2 weeks, and you're going to go to bed at 8 o'clock every night. The longest 2 weeks of my life. You see, I didn't know parents could do something like that, change the rules in the middle of the game. But let me tell you, my dad did the right thing. My dad understood that spanking me under those circumstances wasn't going to do any good. I got several spankings when I was growing up. You know, I don't remember hardly any of them, but I do remember, and I will never forget, that one instance of parental punishment. You see, in those circumstances, spanking was not the best way to punish me. So spanking's not the only form of punishment. But we do need to understand that spanking children is a God-approved and necessary tool as a part of raising children. And ladies and gentlemen, that means that the popular idea in the minds of many people today that it is never appropriate to spank a child is just plain wrong and foolish. Now, I didn't write these verses. Writers inspired by God wrote them. And that means that despite whatever Dr. Spock or Dr. Know-It-All or anybody else might say, God's Word is true. Paul told the Romans in Romans 3 verse 4, indeed, let God be true and every man a liar. And so, brothers and sisters, this means that withholding corporal punishment from our children when it is needed is an unloving and cruel act against our children. Now, with those preliminary observations behind us, I want to talk with you this morning about the purpose of corporal punishment, i.e. spanking, the proper parental attitude when administering corporal punishment, and some divine encouragements regarding this. We need to understand that corporal punishment is designed for discipline. The Old King James Version uses the word chastening and correction. Go back to Proverbs 13:24. The wise man says, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him properly. I had a brother in Christ argue with me about that passage many years ago in a Bible class. He just didn't believe that if you didn't spank your kid, that that was an act of hatred, but that is what the inspired Word of God says. Proverbs 19 verse 18 says, chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction. And then in Proverbs 22 and verse 15, the text says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him. The Hebrew word that is used in these passages refers to instruction. Corporal punishment. Can I just say spanking? Spanking, when administered properly, is intended to be instructive. It is intended to teach our children something. What does it teach? Well, some would say, oh, it teaches your kids to hit other kids. Not if it is administered properly. Spanking administered properly teaches a child that the action that got him into trouble is unbecoming and unacceptable, and it cannot and will not be tolerated. Spanking is for discipline. Spanking is not so much something that you do to a child, it is something that you do for a child. And then in the second place, spanking is for deliverance from Sheol. The wise man says in Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 14, you shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. It's the Hebrew word Sheol, the realm of the dead. And under the Old Testament dispensation, a good spanking could save a child from dying. You may recall that in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 and following, the law of Moses said that a rebellious and stubborn child was to be stoned to death. You remember that passage? I think the wise man alludes to that in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 17 when he says, the eye that mocks his father and scorns obedience to his mother, the ravens of the valley will pick it out and the young eagles will eat it. Boy, that's pretty graphic, isn't it? That's kind of PG-13, I guess. But the picture here in the proverb is of a child being stoned to death for rebellion, and his body's just left out there, and the birds and the beasts are doing what birds and beasts do. Now, under the new covenant, children are spared capital punishment. Someone has wisely observed that this is something that many teenagers should be thankful for. But even today, corporal punishment, spanking, can deliver a child from physical death. That's why we spank small children, to keep them from touching a hot stove or running out into the middle of a busy street or playing with firearms. I remember Kathy saying that John wandered off, I think, when he was just a young fella, and she didn't know where he was, and finally she found him and she wore him out. I mean, she was scared. She wanted to impress upon John in his seat of understanding that you don't run off and go somewhere where your parents don't know where you are. That's why we spank our children when they refuse to respect our authority. Brothers and sisters, if children do not learn to respect the authority of their parents, they will not respect the authority of their teachers at school. They will not respect the authority of policemen and other people in authority. They will not respect the authority of elders in a local church. And ultimately, they will not respect the authority of God. An undisciplined child is a danger not only to himself but to other people. And so there are times when we need to spank our children to protect them from danger and even death. But spanking is also to give our children wisdom. Listen to the wise man, Proverbs 29, verse 15. The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. The fact is, most undisciplined children become clueless adults and a drain on their families and their communities. But spanking is also to be administered for maintaining family order and peace. The wise man says in Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 17, correct your son and he will give you rest. Yes, he will give delight to your soul. Many years ago, I remember hearing Brother Art Ogden say in a gospel meeting sermon, I think, I don't remember when, I don't remember where, but he said that early in his tenure as a parent, he and his wife were having trouble with their oldest daughter, Vicky. And a young preacher just told him, I guess kind of flat out, you don't have control over your daughter. You need to get control over her. And Brother Art thought about that, and I guess he decided that this young preacher's advice was right on the money, and so he waited until Vicky did something that she shouldn't do, and he spanked her. Maybe he spanked her like she had never been spanked before. And he told her, now Vicky, when your daddy calls you, you got to come to me. You can't delay, you can't go somewhere, you can't run away. And he let her go, and she walked across the room, and Brother Art said, Vicky, come here. And she didn't. And he grabbed her and he wore her out again. And Brother Art said we never had any more trouble with Vicky. He got her attention. He got control. Show me a home where the rod of correction is not used, and I will show you a home where the children rule the roost. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not what God intended. I'll show you a home where moms and dads are continually embarrassed, where life is chaos. In my first full-time work down in southern Indiana, I worked for a small church, which is now the New Salisbury congregation. And there was a widow with 2 young children in that congregation. Her husband was tragically diagnosed with cancer, I think around Thanksgiving time, if I remember correctly, and he was dead, I think, before Christmas. And her 2 young kids were running her ragged. And you know why that happened? I was a young single preacher, but it didn't take me long to understand why that was happening, why her life was just chaotic, is because she would threaten and threaten and threaten punishment and not deliver. And finally, when she did deliver, it was, you ought not do that. The interesting thing that I observed about those kids is sometimes they would go home with a family in the congregation for Sunday afternoon, and they were perfect little angels. This woman didn't have control of her kids. And they were making her life miserable. If you want peace in your home, get a hold of your kids. But now there's some attitudes that need to characterize parents when they punish their children, and there's some attitudes, of course, that they shouldn't have. You should not spank your kids out of anger or because they have embarrassed you. Have you ever seen some parent in a public situation who just has enough of little Johnny or little Susie, and in a fit of crimson-faced anger, they start beating the tar out of their child, saying, "You aren't going to embarrass me like that." I suspect maybe all of us have seen that kind of thing happen. We might be able to understand why parents would react that way out of frustrations. But let me tell you, folks, that's not what the book of Proverbs is talking about. We should not discipline our children out of anger. Tony Campolo, a well-known sociologist, a college professor, delivered a motivational speech in Chicago that my parents heard as a part of a business convention, and they got the tape, and I listened to the tape, and he was making the point that parents should never discipline their children in anger. He was making that point in one of his classes, and the next day, one of his students came in, and he had written a poem in response entitled, "Never Strike a Child in Anger." The poem went something like this: "Never strike a child in anger, never hit him when irate, save it for some happy time when both are feeling great. Save it for some happy bedtime, and as you tuck him in his crib, clench your fist and let him have it, or better, choke him with his bib. Wait until a Sunday morning and try to catch him at his prayers, and as he whispers, 'God bless Dada,' kick him neatly down the stairs. Or how about a birthday party when friends and laughter fill the house? Then bash him with the cake you've lettered, 'Greetings to the little louse.' Although he breaks your Wedgwood china and spills your coffee on the floor, never strike a child in anger. It's not civilized anymore. It makes a child feel insecure when parents strike or shove, but you can do him in completely as long as it's done in love. Well, the student was kind of making fun of Mr. Campolo, but Tony Campolo was right. You should never discipline a child in anger. And you should never discipline a child for simply being a child. As adults, we have to understand that boys will be boys. Of course, somebody said they don't have to be the James boys, and there's some truth in that. But kids are going to be kids, and you can't expect a man's head on a boy's shoulder. In 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 11, Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. When I was a young lad and my grandma Norma would take us kids to Salem, but the first place I would go was G.C. Murphy's right there on the square, and Stan, the first place I'd go inside the store was the toy department to check out the cap pistols. I don't do that anymore. I don't go to the toy department. Well, Kathy might say it's just a different toy department, the computer section in Best Buy. You know that old adage that the only difference between men and boys is the price of their toys. There's some truth in that too. But I did things when I was a boy that I don't do anymore. One comedian has said that kids are just little adults with brain damage. But really, they are boys and girls who talk and think and reason differently than adults. That's the way God designed us. I did an AI search earlier this week asking the question, well, when does the human brain fully develop? And the co-pilot response was in your mid-20s. Maybe now we understand why teenagers act the way they act sometimes. Kids are going to be kids. And when we hear horror stories about parents beating their babies because they're crying or because they've wet their diapers, I mean, those are extreme cases. But you should not spank your kid because he's not acting like an adult. Because he doesn't talk like an adult talks. Because he doesn't reason like an adult reasons. What should we spank our children for? The wise man says foolishness. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him. So what is foolishness? Well, let's let the wise man answer that question. Uncontrolled outbursts of anger is described as foolishness. The wise man says in Proverbs 14:17, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of wicked intentions is hated. Parents, don't let your child's uncontrolled anger run roughshod over you. Self-exaltation is described as foolishness in Proverbs 30, verse 32. If you have been foolish in exalting yourself, or if you have devised evil, put your hand on your mouth. A mind set on destruction is described as foolishness in Proverbs 14, verse 1, when it says the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pulls it down with her hands. There are some kids who just love to tear up things. They crave destruction, and our job as parents is to drive that craving out of them. You remember the story about the boy that got caned, beaten with a cane somewhere in the Orient several years ago? That happened because he was destructive, destroying things. What's foolishness? Well, disrespect is foolishness. The wise man says in Proverbs 15, verse 20, a wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish man despises his mother. Moms and dads, do not let your children talk disrespectfully to you. Don't let them talk disrespectfully to their grandparents, to their teachers, to anyone who has authority over them. That's not merely childishness to despise authority. It is out and out rebellion, and that must be driven out of our children. Lying is described as foolishness in Proverbs 10, verse 18. Whoever hides hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. Unwillingness to receive instruction is described as foolishness in Proverbs 18, verse 2. A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. The wise man says in Proverbs 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Someone has well said that if you have a child for whom words mean nothing, it is time for you to teach without words. Well, finally, let me offer 3 encouragements to parents when it comes to disciplining or punishing their children. Do it at the proper time. The wise man says in Proverbs 19:18, chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction. That statement implies that there will come a time when there will be no more hope. You've got to discipline your children while it will accomplish something, while it will help them, before it's too late. And if you wait too long to discipline your children, it won't do any good. The wise man says in Proverbs 23, verse 13, do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. I remember my father saying to me before he spanked me on more than one occasion, this is going to hurt me worse than it hurts you. Did your parents say that kind of thing to you? Janice said her parents never said that. I thought all parents kind of went to the same university because they all wound up saying the same things. I think I have a better understanding of that statement than I did when I first heard it. I remember Brother Mark Alford, a member of the church in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where I preach, now one of the elders in that congregation, saying that he spanked his daughter, Callie Jo, for something that she had done that was wrong, and he said, I went in the other room and I bawled like a baby. The second word of encouragement I want to give you is you're not going to hurt your child. Again, we're not talking about child abuse. We're not talking about beating a child to a pulp. That's not what these Proverbs are all about. But spanking, when properly administered out of love and administered with care, is not going to hurt your kid. I remember Sewell Hall's wife saying that when Sewell was a young boy and his mother spanked him with a switch, she would hold her arm down next to his bare legs, and she would switch him and her arm at the same time so she'd know not to go too far. Vicky's giving me this, well, I don't know how to describe the look. I better not go anywhere with that. There was a mom who was concerned about proper discipline and not going too far. That's the point. I got a lot of spankings growing up. Not as many as I deserved. I'm pretty sure about that. But they didn't hurt me. And they didn't teach me to be mean or violent. The so-called experts say that if you spank your kid, you're going to teach them to be mean and violent and hit other people. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. It's just flat wrong. Didn't teach me to be mean and violent. Finally, the Bible teaches that it works. The wise man says in Proverbs 29:17, correct your son, and he will give you rest. Yes, he will give delight to your soul. Somebody says, well, if you spank your kid, he's going to grow up hating you. There is a theological, technical term for that. Here it is. Hogwash. I didn't grow up hating my parents. I miss my dad. When he would get Alan and I up on Saturday morning on a cold winter day because we were out of firewood and we had to go out and cut firewood with snow on the ground, that wasn't always the most pleasant experience. But let me tell you something, I wish I could cut firewood with my dad now. Before you spank your child, you need to explain why you are doing that. When my dad was a wee lad, his mother would tell him, and I've told this story before, but you're going to hear it again because I don't have a better story. Grandma Mabel would say, Willis, I'm going to spank you because I love you. And then my dad would say there were many a times that I wish that she hadn't loved me quite so much because she would proceed to wail the daylights out of me. I can't tell you how many times I heard my dad say that from the pulpit when I was growing up. I think Brother Aud McKee has preached meetings here in years gone by. I don't know if you had the opportunity to meet his wife, Verna, but I understand that she used to tell her boys, I'm going to love you no matter what you do, but I'm going to spank you so everybody else will love you too. And after you finish spanking your child for his disobedience, you need to reaffirm your love. When we were small and Daddy would spank us, afterwards he would say, come here and give me a hug. I don't remember that being hard to do. And there was never a time that I doubted my Father's love for me. Paul says in Ephesians 6 verse 4, As it is translated in the Legacy Standard Bible, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Parenting isn't easy. It takes a lot of wisdom. There's a lot of good advice out there, but there's a lot of bad advice as well. Young parents, if you've not read James Dobson's book, Dare to Discipline, may I recommend that book to you. If you've not read his book, The Strong-Willed Child, I would recommend that book for your consideration as well. But folks, we need to learn to parent from the perfect parent, God Almighty. And God's encouragement is that you can do it. You can be a successful parent. You can train your kids to be good kids, and you can have a happy home. And so may God give parents the wisdom and the courage to be the kind of parents that God wants them to be, to punish their children appropriately when they need to be punished. Again, it is something that you do for your children. And it's my opinion that many parents do not do that because it's inconvenient, because they don't want the hassle. But it's something you must do for your children. Let's stand and sing.